Wyoming Territory, 1878, the wind howled across the open range as a stagecoach wheel snapped clean off and sent the whole rig tilting hard into the dirt. Ruth Vallen landed face first in the dust, bonnet half torn, skirt tangled around her boots. She pushed herself up with a grunt, spitting grit from her mouth. The driver was already hollering to the heavens and swearing about the busted axle. The other passenger, a banker's wife from Boston, clutched her pearls and stared like Ruth had grown horns. "I told you we should have waited for the army escort," the woman sniffed. Ruth stood, brushed herself off, and glanced across the wide plain. Nothing but dry grass, hills rolling off into the dusty blue. The nearest town, if she remembered right, was Red Bluff, maybe 15 miles west. "Some escort," Ruth muttered. "We would have been robbed or dead by now." She was still muttering when a rider came up over the ridge, alone, tall in the saddle, rifle across his back. Horse lean and fast, coat mottled with trail dust. He slowed as he neared, his eyes sweeping over the wrecked coach and the two women. His hat shadowed his face but not his voice. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and calm. "Anyone hurt?" The banker's wife stepped back like he might bite. Ruth stayed still. "No injuries, just lost a wheel." "Driver says we're stuck." The cowboy dismounted, tying his reins to the busted coach. He moved like someone used to solving problems without asking permission. He crouched, inspected the wheel, then stood and looked over at Ruth. "You got a name?" he asked. "Ruth Vallen," she said. "From Missouri." "Heading to Red Bluff," he nodded once. "Harlan Graves, ranch is 15 miles that way, I can get you there." Ruth blinked. "Just me." He looked at the banker's wife, who was already shaking her head. "She's waiting here for another coach," he said. "You're welcome to ride with me." Ruth hesitated. She had been on the road for 5 straight days. She had left behind everything: her brother's debt-ridden farm, the judgmental whispers, the suitor who had walked out when she said she was not interested in being someone's second-hand dream. Red Bluff was supposed to be a fresh start. A teaching job, a room above the chapel, a quiet life. She stepped forward. "All right." He helped her onto the horse behind him, his hand steady and warm against hers. She settled in, careful not to touch too much, but close enough to feel the heat of him. He clicked his tongue and the horse moved out, smooth and fast across the prairie. "You are not what I expected," Ruth said after a while. Harlan glanced over his shoulder. "Neither are you," he said. "And I like that." They rode in silence a while longer, wind in their faces. The sun sank low, gold bleeding into the hills. Ruth held on, not just for balance, but because something about him made her feel steadier than she had in weeks. By the time they reached Graves' ranch, dusk was setting in. The house was modest, 1-floor, stone chimney, barn set off to the side. A girl stood by the porch holding a bucket of water. Maybe 10 years old, with bright eyes and dark braids. "Nella," Harlan called as they approached. "We got company." The girl lit up when she saw him. "Pa," she called, setting the bucket down and running over. Ruth blinked. "Pa." Harlan helped her down before swinging out of the saddle himself. He ruffled the girl's hair. "This is Ruth," he said. "Stage broke down. She's staying the night." Nella gave Ruth a wide-eyed smile. "Did you come from a city?" "Sort of," Ruth said, surprised by the warmth in the child's voice. "A small one." Nella nodded like that was the most interesting thing she had ever heard. Inside, the house was clean and plain. One long table, a fireplace with iron hooks for cooking. Harlan moved with quiet ease, setting water to boil, slicing cornbread while Nella set the table. "Where's her mother?" Ruth asked. "Passed," Harlan said simply. 5 years ago." Ruth lowered her gaze. "I am sorry," he nodded, not asking for pity, just stating truth. Dinner was stew and warm bread. Nella sat next to Ruth, full of questions about Missouri and dresses and whether snow really piled up that high. Ruth answered gently, caught off guard by how much she liked the girl. After supper, Harlan showed Ruth to a small guest room. "I will ride you to town in the morning," he said at the door. She looked up at him. "Thank you," he met her eyes. "You are not what I expected either. Thought you would be like the others." "What others?" "Eastern women, fine shoes, nose in the air." Ruth laughed. I am not fine, I promise you that. He smiled, not wide but real. Good night, Ruth. She watched him go, heartbeat steady and strange in her chest. She had not come west looking for anyone, but Harlan Graves had a quiet way of making space feel safe. And that little girl with her questions and big eyes was more than just a child. She was a piece of this man's heart. Ruth lay awake longer than she meant to, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the faint creak of the house settling. She had not come here for love. But she was starting to wonder if love had found her anyway. Ruth woke to the low drone of morning chores, hoofbeats in the paddock, the scrape of metal against wood, Nella's voice rising and falling in some half-sung rhyme. Pale light filtered through the muslin curtains, soft and clean. She sat up slowly, boots on the floor before her thoughts had settled. Her back ached faintly from travel, but it was the good kind of sore, the kind that came from moving forward. She laced her boots, braided her hair, and stepped into the kitchen with her sleeves still unbuttoned. Harlan stood near the hearth, lifting an iron kettle from the hook. He wore a dark vest now, sleeves rolled, collar open. The scent of chicory coffee drifted through the space. "There's bread and preserves if you're hungry," he said. "I am," she said, reaching for a plate. "Do you always rise this early?" He poured coffee into a tin mug, handed it to her. "Started young, never could shake it." She took a careful sip. "You built this place yourself, with my brother. He moved east last winter, couldn't take the winters anymore." She looked out the window. Nella was scattering feed to the chickens, her braids swinging like a pendulum. "You raise her alone." Harlan didn't answer right away. He cut a slice of bread and passed it to her. "I try." Ruth ate in silence a while, watching the steam curl from her mug. Then, without looking up, she asked, "Do you miss the company?" He leaned against the table's edge, arms crossed loosely. "Some days, other days, I don't remember what it's like." She nodded, chewing slowly. "I used to think I'd marry a shopkeeper, someone with a good hat and a quiet voice. I thought that would be enough." "That what sent you west?" She wiped her mouth with the edge of her sleeve. "What sent me west was realizing I'd rather be alone than live someone else's life." He studied her, not with curiosity but understanding. "You take the teaching job in Red Bluff." "I intend to. Schoolhouse is small, but they've kept it up. I wired ahead." He stood, took her empty plate without a word, and rinsed it in the basin. "I'll hitch the wagon. We'll be there before noon." She followed him to the barn, where the horses waited in their stalls. The air smelled of straw and sun-warmed wood. He lifted a saddle with practiced hands, setting it across the mare's back. "You ever taught before?" he asked. 3 winters in a room above a bakery. 12 children, 1 stove, and a roof that leaked." She smiled faintly. "It'll feel like luxury having a whole building to myself." He cinched the girth, then looked over at her. "You're braver than you let on." She met his gaze. "You're quieter than I expected." He stepped closer, one hand on the reins. "Most things worth saying don't need repeating." The wagon ride was slow and steady. Nella rode beside Ruth, pointing out badger holes and gullies with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and root. The land stretched wide, grass thick with spring, cottonwoods just starting to green. A pair of antelope bounded in the distance, white tails flashing. "Do you like books?" Nella asked suddenly. "I do," Ruth said. "Do you?" "I like the ones with maps. Pa says stories are better when you know where they come from." Ruth glanced at Harlan, who kept his eyes on the trail. "He's right." They reached Red Bluff by mid-morning. The town was modest, 2 rows of buildings, a livery, a mercantile, and a church with 1 bell. Children played in the dust near a water pump. A woman swept her porch with slow, practiced strokes. Harlan stopped the wagon in front of the chapel. "You want me to come in with you?" "I can manage," Ruth said, but she didn't move right away. Nella leaned over. "Will you visit us?" Ruth touched her hand gently. "If your father doesn't mind." "I don't," Harlan said. "You're welcome anytime." She stepped down and gathered her carpet bag. The preacher's wife came out to greet her, all warm smiles and strong arms. Ruth glanced back as she crossed the yard. Harlan raised his hand in a small wave. Nothing grand. Just steady. That night in her new room above the chapel, Ruth unpacked slowly. The bed was narrow, the walls plain, but the window looked out over the hills. She opened it wide, letting the wind in. Below, the town slowed into evening. A dog barked once. Someone's fiddle sang faintly across the way. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her knees, breathing deep. She thought of Nella's map books, of Harlan's stillness, of the way his voice never hurried. She hadn't planned to find anything like that. But maybe plans weren't the only things that mattered. The first letter came folded inside a volume of natural history, slid discreetly between pages on the feeding habits of prairie sparrows. Ruth found it a week after her arrival in Red Bluff, the morning sun streaking across her desk as she unpacked the donation crate from the mercantile. Her thumb caught the corner of the parchment before the book even hit the shelf. The handwriting was rough-edged and deliberate, as if each word had been thought through twice. Miss Vallen, Nella says she's finished her arithmetic slate and wants more. Thought maybe you had something better than numbers to keep her busy. I can ride her into town Saturday if that suits. H.G. The initials weren't necessary. She'd have known who it was just by the sparseness of it. No flourishes, no needless sentiment, just a father thinking of his daughter, and maybe something more. Ruth folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside her ledger before returning to the crate. The rhythm of her days had begun to settle, less dust in her clothes, fewer glances from townsfolk who had eyed her curiously that first week, and then figured she wasn't here to cause trouble. The children were polite, if wary, their eyes flicking between her and the blackboard like they weren't sure which would crack first. She hadn't seen Harlan since he left her outside the chapel, but she thought of him more than made sense. Saturday came with a high blue sky and the kind of wind that tugged at sleeves and made the curtains jump. Ruth stood outside the schoolhouse as the wagon approached. Nella waved with her whole arm, her braid unraveling down her back. Harlan sat quiet, one hand resting lightly on the reins. Ruth stepped down from the porch. I've got a copybook for her, and a reader if she's ready. She's been up before dawn practicing her numbers on the barn wall, Harlan said, reaching for the books she offered. Used up half a stick of chalk. Nella climbed down and hugged the books like they were something rare. Do any of them have poems? One or two, Ruth said. You like poems, if they don't rhyme too much. Ruth smiled. Then I think you'll like these. Harlan waited beside the wagon, watching Nella settle onto the porch steps with the books. Ruth moved to stand nearer to him, brushing dust from her skirt. Did you write to me because of her, or did you just want to see if I'd answer? His eyes stayed on Nella, but his mouth pulled into something near a grin. Didn't think you'd mind either way. I didn't, she said. But I might have answered differently if it was just about schoolwork. He glanced at her sideways. Would you have said no? I'd have asked what took you so long. He exhaled through his nose, slow and quiet. I came close first time I passed the church. But it was Sunday, and I figured you had better company than me. I've had worse, she said. He looked back toward Nella, then down at his boots. You left something behind when you came here. Nothing I needed, she said. He shook his head. I brought all of it with me. Every last hard thing. Ruth tilted her head. And have you set any of it down since? Not yet, but it feels lighter lately. She didn't speak for a moment. The air around them smelled faintly of sun, warmed hay, and iron from the horseshoe tacked on the schoolhouse wall. Nella had started reading aloud to herself, lips moving in silent rhythm. I've got a kettle on the stove inside, Ruth said. If you've time, I do. They sat on opposite sides of the small table, the tin teapot between them. Harlan shifted once, then leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Do you miss the city? I miss the libraries, Ruth said. But not the way people looked through me, he nodded. Here they look until they figure out if they need to worry. And once they don't, they stop looking. She poured the tea without asking if he'd take any. He took the mug and drank like it was something familiar, not fine. She noticed the way his fingers curled around the tin, not tight but secure. Do you ever think about leaving this place? She asked. I used to, he said, when the nights were long and the quiet didn't sit right. But it's not the same now. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. What changed? He looked at her finally. You showed up with dust on your boots and didn't ask for anything I didn't have. She held his gaze. And you gave what you did have without waiting to be asked. Nella's voice called from the porch. Pa, there's a line about a river in here that sounds like ours. Harlan stood slowly. She's gonna want to show you. Might be best to come out before she starts reciting. Ruth followed him to the door. Nella held the book open, pointing at a stanza about slow-moving water and willows that bent like old women. Ruth knelt beside her. You've got a good ear, she said. You catch the way it sounds like it's moving. I think it's about missing home, Nella said. Maybe, Ruth said softly, or maybe it's about finding one. Harlan offered his hand to help Ruth up from the porch step. She took it, her fingers fitting into his without thought. He didn't let go right away. I'll be back next week, he said, voice steady. I'll be here. As the wagon pulled away, the wind kicked up again, rustling the grass near the steps. Ruth watched them go, the ache in her chest not sharp, just present like the kind of longing that comes from knowing something good has begun. And this time, she wasn't afraid of its weight. April deepened along the high plains, and with it came the soft hush of thaw. Snowmelt carved thin silver threads through the gullies behind the chapel, and the cottonwoods along the creek let out their first pale leaves like cautious promises. Ruth had begun to leave the schoolhouse door open during lessons. The children worked quieter with the wind slipping through, and she liked the way the sunlight settled on the floor, never in a hurry, never too much. Saturday came again with the sound of hooves outside the schoolhouse. Ruth stepped out before the knock, wiping chalk from her hands. Nella jumped down from the wagon holding a small tin box, cheeks pink from the ride. I brought something for the class, she said, lifting the lid. It's pressed violets for the window. They'll like that, Ruth said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. They've been waiting for something to bloom. Harlan stayed by the wagon, reins looped loosely in one hand. He wore a faded blue workshirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the collar sun-worn at the edges. His gaze lingered on the curve of the sky. There were storm clouds far off, crouched low, but they hadn't moved in yet. You ever ride north of the Butts? He asked as Ruth approached. Not yet, she said. I've barely seen the hills behind town. There's a split in the ridge, he said. Water runs cleaner up there. Nella and I head that way sometimes. You might like it. I might, she said, watching his face. If I had a guide. You would, he said. They didn't speak again until the children filed out after lessons, trailing behind Nella like ducklings. Ruth sat on the edge of the porch after, her boots dusty, skirt hem damp from a spill at the water pump. Harlan brought 2 cups from the wagon enamel, chipped at the rims, and offered her one. Apple tea, he said. She made it herself. Burned half the kitchen, but it's drinkable. Ruth took the cup carefully. The tea was sweet in a way that reminded her of orchard windfalls, bruised but still good. She watched the edges of his profile, how his jaw moved when he drank, how his eyes stayed on the road like he was waiting for something to rise up from it. Do you ever think about going south? She asked. He glanced at her, then back to the horizon. When I was younger. Thought maybe I'd chase cattle through Texas or follow the river down to New Orleans. But I didn't want to leave her behind. She was small when her mother passed, not yet walking, wouldn't take a bottle. I tied her to my chest with a flour sack and rode fence one-handed. He said it without weight, like a story told enough times to smooth the edges. Ruth shifted her cup between her palms. Your wife, was she from here? No, he said. She came west with a cousin. Thought she'd find work in the mining towns. She was kind but always restless, couldn't stand the quiet. Ruth didn't ask more, she didn't need to. I wasn't sure I'd be enough, he said after a while. For Nella, for the ranch, for anyone, you are, Ruth said. You just don't say it out loud. He looked at her then, full and steady. You're not what I expected, he said, the words slow. She didn't look away. Neither are you, she said, and I like that. He set his cup down on the porch rail. Come riding with us tomorrow. Where? North. I'll pack something to eat, she nodded. I'll be ready at first light. They stood together as evening settled, the town behind them quieting to smoke and supper sounds. Nella called from the wagon, her voice curling around a song Ruth didn't know. Harlan touched Ruth's elbow lightly before he stepped away, not possession, not hesitation, just a simple mark of presence. She watched them go until the wagon turned past the chapel. Then she went inside, set the pressed violets on the windowsill, and opened a fresh page in her journal. She didn't write anything, only sat with the pen in hand, the ink breathing quietly in its bottle. Tomorrow stretched before her like a road not yet ridden, and for the first time in years, she felt no need to walk it alone. They rode out before the light had fully shaken loose from the horizon, the air still holding the brittle edge of night. Ruth sat astride the gray mare Harlan had saddled for her, the borrowed reins rough in her hands but steady. Nella rode ahead on a smaller gelding, her silhouette sharp against the palling sky, her braid tied with a strip of blue cloth Ruth hadn't seen before. The trail north curved behind a ridge thick with juniper, then opened into country that felt untouched. The scrub gave way to soft rises and swells, scatterings of wild lupine, and the scent of damp earth rising as the sun warmed the frost from the grass. Ruth's skirt pulled at her knees with each shift of the saddle, but she didn't mind. She liked the ache. She liked the quiet between them, filled only by hoofbeats and the sound of Nella humming to herself. They stopped near midday where a spring surfaced between two stones, the water cold and clear as glass. Harlan unpacked bread wrapped in cloth and a wedge of pale cheese, while Ruth and Nella gathered kindling for a fire. They didn't speak until the warmth had worked back into their fingers. "You ever see a tornado?" Nella asked, crouching beside the fire, her cheeks smudged with soot. "Once," Ruth said. "Back in Missouri, it pulled the roof clean off the Grange Hall, tossed it into the creek like a child pitching a toy. Pa says they don't come this far west. They don't." "Not often." Harlan passed her a slice of bread and sat beside her on the grass, his knee brushing hers without apology. She didn't shift away. "Hard to believe you lived in a place with Grange Halls," he said, voice low. "I didn't stay in them," she said. "But I saw what they looked like when the wind decided it didn't care how well they were built." Nella wandered off to chase a butterfly with a stick, and Ruth leaned back on her palms, tilting her face toward the sun. "You left Missouri," Harlan said, "but you carry parts of it with you." "I carry what didn't break me," she said. He watched her, not with doubt, but with a kind of quiet regard that made her heartbeat shift in her chest. There was no need to explain herself again, she could see that now. He understood things without leaning on questions. "I think about staying," she said after a moment, "not just in Red Bluff, but something more permanent. With us, with you," she said, "if it's something you want." He reached over, slow and sure, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused, but the pressure was careful, like he knew what it cost her to offer the question without armor. "I've been thinking about that since the first morning you poured me coffee," he said. "Didn't know how to ask. You just did." Nella returned, breathless, holding a feather she claimed had fallen from a hawk. Ruth tucked it behind the girl's ear. By late afternoon, they'd turned back toward the ranch. The trail seemed shorter somehow, as if the land had softened beneath their hooves. Ruth rode beside Harlan this time, their shoulders near enough to touch. He reached over once, adjusting a strap on her saddle without saying a word. She let him. They arrived as the sun fell behind the barn, casting long shadows across the field. Harlan lifted Nella down first, then turned to Ruth. She didn't wait for his hand this time. She met him halfway, stepped down, and stood close. "You still want that quiet life?" he asked. "I want a life that's mine," she said. "And I want it beside someone who doesn't ask me to be less." He leaned in, slow as twilight, and kissed her there in the dust before the house. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that came after choices had been made, when the heart no longer needed convincing. That night, Ruth stayed in the house with them. Nella dragged blankets down from the loft and insisted on making up the spare cot herself. Ruth helped her fold the quilt, then slipped back into the kitchen where Harlan stood at the stove, stirring something with a wooden spoon. "You're letting her run the place," Ruth said, smiling. "She always has," he said. "You just gave her someone to run it for." The stew was simple, and the bread was burned at the edges, but the warmth in the room was something Ruth hadn't known she missed until it was hers. Weeks passed. Ruth returned to Red Bluff only to gather her things. The schoolhouse board met her resignation with polite disappointment and quiet relief. They'd found someone else, a widow with grown sons and time to spare. Ruth left behind her ledgers and her chalk, but carried her books north in a crate Harlan nailed shut himself. They married in early June beneath a cottonwood near the spring. The preacher rode up from town, hat in hand, and Nella wore a dress Ruth had sewn from muslin and scraps. There was no music, only the wind through the grass and the sound of two people speaking words that needed no embellishment. That summer, Ruth planted vegetables in the side yard and read aloud from Nella's new books in the evenings. She and Harlan built a lean-to for the goats, then added a second room to the house when the nights began to cool again. They didn't speak often of the lives they'd left behind. But sometimes, when the fire burned low and the wind shifted, Ruth would find Harlan watching her with that same quiet look he'd worn the first evening they met. She'd cross the room without needing to ask what he was thinking. And he'd reach for her always, like she was the last piece of something long unfinished. They lived like that steadily together and full of days worth remembering.